Don't you think that barring the Himalayan, every other motorcycle in the Royal Enfield portfolio qualifies to be a modern classic? A classic standard, a classic cafe racer, a classic cruiser. But then again, this is the only one that is called the classic. Probably because this is the only one that is an ode to the original from the 40s. And because it retains their style, it can easily pass off as another color update. But believe it or not, this is actually the all-new Classic 350.
It would have been a tough one to design though. Or was it too easy? You decide. Because you see, they had to ensure that it looks like the Classic no matter what angle and distance you look at it from. But at the same time, it had to be modern enough to feel like an upgrade. The answer came by way of the niceties we saw on the Meteor 350. Like the rounded off grips, the retro style switchgear, an updated instrumentation, and most importantly, better fit and finish.
The instrumentation is an evolution of the design that we saw on the outgoing 350. This one still has that analog speedometer, very easy to read, but the telltale lights, they're a bit too tiny, and in wet conditions like these, it can be a little hard to read any of these. Otherwise, it's all good news on this panel because you finally get a fuel gauge on this, digital of course, very easy to read. You also get a tripper navigation module. We saw that on the Meteor, but this one is much neatly integrated with that chrome ring around it. However, you get this tripper module only on the top variants of the Classic 350. On the lower variants, it is simply replaced by the RE roundel. And finally, the position of the key is still on this panel, but this one now not only operates the ignition, but can also lock the handlebar if required.
The paintwork on the outgoing Classic 350s already looked great, but the new one feels even better now because of the fit, finish and the cable management, which is much improved.
Remember the signature green color on the Classic? There was a running joke back in the day about how that color was so much like a Meru cab. Now there's an interesting story about that color. It was originally supposed to be a grey, but a printing mistake made it look green on the brochure. And Royal Enfield liked that color so much that they actually decided to go ahead with it, give it a try, put it on the motorcycle. It was a big hit. Unfortunately, that iconic color doesn't make it to the new Classic 350. However, there are quite a few interesting shades, interesting finishes to choose from. And as before, the signals and the chrome are still the best combinations that you could get for your money. And this one in particular, I think, is a nod to the colors that we'd seen on the AVL Bullet.
Apart from the new colors, the key changes to the design include a compact taillight unit, a clear lens headlight that retains the tiger eyes on top, and new turn blinkers which sit higher and closer to the headlight. The cradle chassis also has a double down tube which not only looks better but also works better. Similarly, there's an additional arm on the rear frame for the fender, which not only makes it stronger but also protects the rear shock absorbers in case of a fall. The pea shooter exhaust looks more proportionate now because it's shorter. Despite these changes, you certainly won't mistake this motorcycle to be anything else. From the triangular frame to the upright long-stroke engine, it's unmistakably a Royal Enfield Classic.
Even the chassis and the engine come from the Meteor 350, but because this is a standard and not a cruiser, the ergonomics are obviously different. The geometry between the pegs, the handlebar, it's completely different. Now there are a few changes compared to the outgoing Classic 350, but even if you were to ride that motorcycle and this one back to back, you still won't be able to notice the differences in that typical upright riding posture of this motorcycle.
The handlebars have been moved forward and lowered, though by a very small degree. The weight distribution has also changed, but it's only a tiny bit more forward biased than before. The curve weight is also in the same ballpark as the outgoing 350. As before, the Classic 350 is simple to ride for most, and everything from tight hairpins to simple U-turns in the city feel very easy.
Of course, they did save some weight on the new chassis and certain components, but the weight is still in the same ballpark as the outgoing Classic 350, and that is because it now has beefier suspension components.
The fork sleeves may not reveal the differences in a passing glance, but these are now larger 41mm spec, but with the same 130mm travel as before. At the rear, however, a 10mm longer travel than before adds a bit more give and comfort when riding with a pillion and luggage. To that effect, Royal Enfield has also upped the ground clearance by a little bit for those tough roads.
The specs for the suspension might look exactly similar to the Meteor 350. However, the Classic runs different spring rates. I'm guessing they're slightly stiffer because they give a slightly tauter suspension feel compared to the Meteor. And I think it goes very well with the standard body style of this motorcycle. And that said, on surface like this or poor road conditions like these, it actually has quite a supple feel. The ride quality is actually quite comfortable. And like the suspension, another big change to the comfort factor is because of the new seats.
The seats have different foam density than before, and the contouring has been altered slightly for better comfort. If you have complained about long distance comfort on the outgoing Classic, the new one should be marginally better for you.
There's a low seat height option as well, which will reduce the standard 805mm to 773, 32mm drop. But I think for shorter riders, the Meteor is still going to be more accessible, more manageable compared to the Classic 350. At the same time, if you're one of those riders who likes to stand up and ride on poor road surfaces like these covers that you see on the side, they have been given a slightly narrow profile now. So standing up and riding is a lot easier. Getting a good footing here is a lot easier than before. If you also look at these little traction pads on the tank, they've also been integrated much better. The design is also much better, and it's also quite functional, both under braking and as well as when you're standing up and riding on surfaces like these.
The toolbox and battery covers are also redesigned for getting a more comfortable footing when you come to a halt.
Royal Enfield has also retained the Classic seats, which have those exposed springs. It's a part of the options catalogue though, for those of you interested. Also on the list, like before, are touring seats, which can ensure long distance comfort, because this is, after all, the most used motorcycle for touring in India. To that effect, it continues to use an 8-amp battery, but it also has a larger alternator now to support touring accessories like auxiliary lights, 12-volt chargers, louder horns, etc.
The stock lights have been upgraded to multifocal clear lens headlights, which are adequate for city use but not that great for highway runs.
Speaking of highway runs, we must of course talk about the new engine. Now, this is the same engine as the Meteor 350. It sits as the stressed member in the same cradle frame as well. But there are obvious changes. For example, if you look at the exterior, there are some chrome bits. By the way, that winged RE logo that sat here is gone. It was inspired by the Crusader. It's not here anymore. However, what they've done looks quite nice. There are changes to the inside as well. Now, there are tuning changes, of course, not any changes to the hardware. Now, Royal Enfield says that when they set out to tune this motorcycle, they didn't really have any specific tuning in mind compared to the Meteor 350's engine. However, they did fine-tune the fueling, the throttle response as per the feedback received from their test riders. We had to run the numbers, of course, which we did, and here's what the figures look like.
Compared to the outgoing Classic, the new one has a much crisper throttle response, and it now has a higher cruising sweet spot of around 100 km an hour compared to the outgoing motorcycle's 80. It also has better roll-on acceleration from 30 to 50, which essentially means that unlike before, overtakes come quicker, and that makes a world of a difference to how brisk the Classic feels now. The advantages may seem marginal in the city, but make a big difference on the highway, though I wish the clutch was a bit lighter. Sport riders who prefer clutchless shifts by briefly closing the throttle to upshift will realize that in higher gears, the clutch doesn't engage or disengage properly, leading to jerks and pulses from the engine. So shifting in the conventional manner using the clutch lever is the way to go. The touring range and fuel economy is on par with the outgoing motorcycle.
It is a two-valve engine, of course, but a lot smoother than the older unit construction engine, or UCE as it was popularly called. And as you were aware, as you were afraid, the thump, well, it's not the same anymore, but honestly, it's not that disappointing. Take a listen. Now, whatever little thump you get that below the 2500 RPM mark. Beyond that, as the BPMs rise, Basically, it smoothens out, it starts sounding like any other single cylinder engine of this capacity from the modern era. Well, it still sounds quite unique. Let me not say any other. It has its unique style to it, but it's not that iconic thump anymore. And while it may not amount to much, that bulge you had in the header pipe for the BS6 engine Classic 350 that's going out, that is now gone. This is a much cleaner looking design.
While the new engine helps the Classic achieve better speeds, larger disc rotors and calipers from the Meteor 350 also give the new Classic much better braking manners to go with the increased performance. The brake feel is much better too, compared to the spongy brakes on the outgoing machine. There's a big improvement to the ABS as well, and you will appreciate how confidently the bike stops even if you slam the brakes from 60 km an hour on gravelly or poor road surfaces. Please note that all this feedback of mine is for models equipped with the dual channel ABS, and these are the variants that I would recommend for all.
Despite the age of the outgoing Classic 350, I was quite impressed with its riding dynamics. It didn't carry a lot of corner speed, of course, but it felt very confident with whatever speed it carried through the corner. It had a nice taut handling to it. The new one does that as well. The only problem with the previous model was, of course, the spongy brakes, which have now been fixed with the new one. This one also gets better rubber, wider tires on wider rims for a wider contact patch.
We have used these Seat tires before, which have been made to Royal Enfield specifications, and they continue to impress even in the wet. They feel confident around the bends too. Unfortunately, Royal Enfield has still not designed a tubeless wire spoke wheel to go with their modern classics. So those of you who are looking for additional safety will need to choose alloy wheels from RE's Make It Your program. Though the new Classic continues to use a 19 front and an 18 rear, the white tires impart a tiny bit more confidence than before. The seats and the tank also feel tightly put together, and there are no awkward movements from these when riding in a more spirited manner. In fact, the whole motorcycle now feels tighter and better put together, and that makes for a far nicer riding experience than its outgoing counterpart.
Back to the question we began this review with, creating a successor to the Classic 350. Was that a simple walk in the park for Royal Enfield, or was it a tough nut to crack? I think it was a bit of both. You see, for the designers to recreate this kind of classic body style wouldn't have been difficult, because this is not a sports bike after all, so they were not really gunning for better downforce, sharper aerodynamics, quicker lap times, etc. All of that wasn't a matter of worry. And unlike cars, they didn't really have to worry about a plethora of safety systems to integrate and to worry about. But at the same time, creating a new age platform, creating an engine for the new age emissions, creating a vehicle for the comfort requirements of all the new age clients, that was going to be a tough nut to crack. But they have done all of that quite nicely, and that's all thanks to everything that we saw on the Meteor 350. Truth be told, the new Classic and the Meteor were actually developed together, keeping all these new age requirements in mind, and I think they've done a fabulous job at it. This motorcycle feels fresher, feels better engineered, despite everything that its design might suggest, and I think that's one big feat that Royal Enfield have achieved. Furthermore, the current Classic 350, even after so many years, is still the highest selling 350cc motorcycle in the market at the moment. So creating new benchmarks with this particular bike, I think that is certainly going to be a walk in the park for Royal Enfield.
As always, do let us know what do you think about the new Classic 350. Thank you so much for watching.